It started, as many crimes do, with a man who thought he could do better. Frank Marino wasn't your typical criminal. He was a man in his late 40s, quiet, methodical, and worn down by life. For years, he'd worked as a security supervisor at Dunbar Armored, one of the largest cash transport companies in the United States. Every morning, he watched millions of dollars flow in and out of armored trucks, neat stacks of green bills bound tight with paper bands, guarded like gold. He'd trained drivers, reviewed security footage, checked locks, and followed every rule. But the irony wasn't lost on him. He was surrounded by money every day, yet he could barely afford his rent. Divorce had stripped him of half his savings. Gambling took the rest. By 2012, Frank's life was running on fumes. He wasn't angry at anyone in particular, just tired. Tired of struggling. Tired of watching money move like a river he was forbidden to touch. One night, as he sat in his small apartment eating takeout from a styrofoam box, the thought came to him like a whisper. What if I could pull it off? He laughed at first, but the whisper didn't leave. Frank knew the schedules. He knew when the vaults were most vulnerable, when the guards were tired, when the surveillance system cycled through maintenance. More than anyone, he knew how predictable people could be, especially the ones who thought they were safe. It began as a fantasy, a way to escape his life for a moment, but over the weeks, it turned into something else. A plan. A real one. He started studying security blueprints after hours, memorizing blind spots in the camera network. He learned which nights the armored trucks came back half empty, and when the cash from casinos was stored overnight before redistribution. Every detail became a piece of a puzzle forming in his mind. But even Frank knew one man couldn't do it alone. He needed a crew, not professionals. Professionals talk too much. He wanted people he could control, men who needed the money as badly as he did. That's how it began. Frank called his old friend Eddie Cortez, a former Dunbar driver who'd been fired after a failed drug test. Eddie was reckless but loyal, and he owed Frank a favor. One job, Frank told him over the phone. You'll never have to work again. Eddie didn't hesitate. From there, the plan spread quietly, like a rumor no one dared to repeat. A nightclub bouncer named Tony Ramirez joined next, muscle with a temper, but the kind of guy who didn't ask questions. Then came Derek Coleman, a disgraced security tech who knew how to disable alarms. Finally, Eddie brought in his cousin Ray, a mechanic with a criminal record and a talent for breaking into almost anything. They met in diners and dim garages, speaking in coded phrases. They called it the job, never the heist. Frank warned them, no one gets greedy, no one gets sloppy. We do this once, then we disappear. Still, the idea of millions, cash untraceable, real, hung over him like a fever dream. Frank felt something he hadn't felt in years. Control. Every night, he stood at his window, watching the city lights shimmer, like gold bars in the distance. He knew this was dangerous, but danger made him feel alive again. The plan was simple on paper. Strike on a Friday night, just before the weekend vault transfer. No one would suspect an inside job. They'd be ghosts before sunrise. It sounded perfect, almost too perfect. And in stories like this, that's always the first warning sign. Frank's plan needed more than blueprints. It needed people who could move without thinking, who could follow a rhythm and not ask the obvious questions. It needed loyalty carved from desperation. They met in the corners of the city where fluorescent lights hummed, and nobody asked your name. A greasy spoon off the interstate. A dim storage unit that smelled of oil and old paper. The back room of a bar that shut its doors at 2 a.m. The meetings were short, low-voiced, rehearsed like scenes in a play no one wanted an audience for. Eddie arrived first, as he always did. He had the easy grin of a man who never wanted to look like he was trying too hard. He'd been the one to get Frank the job years earlier, the one who taught him how to count pallets and read delivery manifests. Losing that job had left him hungry in more ways than one. "One clean night," Eddie said, tapping the table, "and we're done." Tony came with the swagger of someone used to imposing presence. In daylight, he sold confidence. At night, that confidence bought silence. He'd worked doors for years, broken up fights with an economy of motion, learned how to read a room before the room finished rearranging itself. He wanted something that felt like a score, something to make his name mean more than intimidation. Derek was different. He barely drank at the meetings. He preferred corners, kept his voice low, and watched the others like someone who'd already practiced betrayal, and decided it wasn't worth the trouble. He knew systems and wires and the invisible logic that kept buildings breathing. He didn't speak of the things he'd done and lost, only the remedy. Clean work, quick in, quick out. "We don't have to be heroes," he'd say. "Just careful." Ray, a younger man with a restless jaw and fingers that could fix anything from a carburetor to a snap lock, brought an undercurrent of restlessness that could tip into recklessness. He laughed too loud at dark jokes, smoked too many cigarettes, and still showed up when asked. He wanted out of his own small-town pattern, wanted to prove he could match his cousin's cool. They practiced in the same way musicians rehearse a solo. Enough repetition to make muscle memory honest, not so much that they lost the adrenaline that sharpens focus. They walked through timings without mentioning specifics. They mapped exits in broad strokes and rehearsed loading and lifting like choreography, heavy breaths, and ordered movement that kept everyone from colliding. Frank rehearsed roles for himself in his head more than anything. He kept his planning close like a lit cigarette. It burned, but it comforted. At night, he would wake and replay the sequence of steps he imagined. The quiet corridor, the hum of fluorescent lights, the slow, soft movement of men who knew what they were doing. Control, he told himself, was the only honest currency left. As the calendar flipped toward the chosen weekend, the city around them hummed on. Friday nights passed with the usual economy of neon and tired smiles. The armored trucks continued their ritual, blind to the human arithmetic at the edge of their routine. Frank watched their routes, read public schedules, and listened to gossip that drifted from break room to barstool. He allowed himself small vanities. A neat stack of cash rolled into a drawer, a padded envelope set aside for his daughter's overdue tuition. Each small prize reinforced the narrative he told himself, that this was for survival, not spectacle. On the night they picked, they dressed in colors that would not startle any casual observer. They hugged loved ones for the last time, telling them mundane truths and rehearsing longer lies. A neighbor who would later tell the police she saw them said only one thing to herself. They looked like men going to work. Frank felt the old adrenaline he had known in other lives, the crispness of danger that made everything seem sharper, more alive. But it was threaded with a new feeling now, a guilt that moved under his skin. He kept replaying a single small image in his mind, his daughter's graduation photograph on the kitchen counter, and tried to reconcile it with what he was about to do. They moved at midnight not because the watch told them to, but because the city's heartbeat thinned. Because midnight makes the world feel smaller and quieter, as if there is less at stake. In the end, the difference between genius and ruin is a matter of inches and timing. Frank chose to believe he had calculated both with surgical calm. But men who build lives from desperation are fragile instruments. Plans that feel perfect in the close light of a garage can unravel under the harsh glare of the city. And as the vans rolled, engines low, toward the place that had stood like a fortress for so long, none of them knew that a single small human error would be the thing that finally unraveled everything. It was a cold Friday night, the kind of night where even the air seemed to hold its breath. The city moved on, unaware. Streetlights hummed, bars filled with laughter. Somewhere, someone won a game. Someone kiss a stranger. Someone turn off the news and went to sleep, while 5 men prepare to make history. Frank Marino stood by his window one last time before leaving. Below him, the streets were slick with rain, shining like liquid metal. He lit a cigarette he didn't really want, just to calm the tremor in his fingers. This is it, he whispered to himself, not with excitement, but with the weary acceptance of a man who'd already crossed the line in his heart long ago. They met at a small warehouse near the edge of Los Angeles, their chosen base of silence. Eddie arrived first, as always, his old pickup rattling like it might fall apart before the night was over. Tony followed, calm but fuming with energy. Derek and Ray came together, faces pale under the dim light. Frank laid out the plan one final time. No notes, no papers, just memory. We go in clean, no noise, no mistakes. We move like ghosts. Once the money's loaded, we're out in 15 minutes. No talking after that. No calls, no visits, nothing. This never happened. Each man nodded, pretending not to feel the weight in his stomach. Then they got into position. Eddie and Ray would handle the entry. They knew the gate, the sensors, the rhythm of the guard's rotation. Derek would take care of the alarm feed from a remote relay point, delaying the security signal for just under 10 minutes. Tony would stay by the truck, ready to move the bags as soon as the vault opened. Frank, of course, would lead. He was the only one who knew every detail, every timing, every weak point in the system he'd helped design years ago. At exactly 12:17 a.m., they rolled toward the Dunbar depot. Rain tapped against the windshield like a warning. The city was silent, the kind of silence that makes you hear your own heart. The gate opened exactly as Frank said it would. No alarms, no guards in sight. They moved fast, the practiced rhythm of men who didn't want to think. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The vault door loomed ahead of them like a sleeping giant. Frank entered the code, calm, deliberate. One wrong digit, and it would have been over. The light blinked green. The vault clicked open with a sound that felt almost holy. Stacks of cash sat inside, tens of millions, neatly wrapped in brown paper. The product of casinos, banks, and armored trucks across the city. For a moment, no one spoke. They just stared. Then Tony broke the silence with a low whistle. Jesus, Frankie, this is unreal. Move, Frank said quietly. Don't look at it. Just move. They worked in silence. One bag, then another. The weight of the money felt strange, heavy, alive, intoxicating. Frank felt the clock ticking louder in his mind than any sound in the room. But then, something small, something human, slipped through. Ray, the youngest, dropped one of the bags. It burst slightly on the edge, bills spilling out across the floor like confetti. Pick it up, Frank hissed. Ray froze. His hands shook. For the first time that night, he realized how real this was. Derek's voice came through the radio, strained. You got 2 minutes. I can't hold the feed any longer. They scrambled. Tony lifted 2 bags at once. Eddie grabbed the last one. Frank shut the vault and wiped the keypad with his sleeve. As they loaded the last bag into the truck, Frank looked back one final time, at the silent vault, at the floor, at the money they left behind. He felt no victory, just the dull ache of inevitability. They drove off into the rain, engines low, hearts pounding. No sirens, no alarms, no chase. The city slept through the biggest armored truck robbery in American history. For now, it looked perfect, but perfection never lasts. The sun rose over Los Angeles like nothing had happened. People drove to work. Kids went to school. The morning news talked about politics, not robberies. Meanwhile, in a quiet garage on the east side, 5 men sat surrounded by more money than they'd ever seen in their lives. Stacks of cash were piled high on a wooden table, still damp from the night's rain. It didn't look real, not at first. It looked like a movie set, something borrowed from Ocean's 11. But as the bills dried, as the smell of ink and sweat filled the air, the reality sank in. They'd done it. Frank Marino didn't smile. He just stood there, arms crossed, looking at what he'd unleashed. "This," he said quietly, "isn't money. It's evidence. We don't touch it until I say so." Tony laughed. "Evidence? Frank, it's $10 million. Evidence of what success?" Frank turned, eyes cold. "Evidence of a crime. You forget that, and we're dead." They agreed to lie low for 6 months. No big purchases, no new cars, no strange behavior. Derek would stash half of it in a rented storage unit under a fake name. The rest would stay with Frank, hidden in industrial containers sealed with metal locks. Everyone nodded. Everyone agreed. But greed has a way of whispering in the dark. 2 weeks later, Tony walked into a dealership in Glendale and bought a 1999 BMW. Cash. The salesman didn't care. He just smiled and counted the bills. But someone noticed. The man behind him in line, an off-duty LAPD officer, thought it was odd. A young man, no job on record, paying in hundreds. He didn't report it, but the image stuck. Meanwhile, the news finally caught up. Record heist at Dunbar Armor Facility. $18.9 million stolen. No suspects identified. The FBI called it the most professional robbery in American history. No fingerprints. No witnesses. No security alarms. Nothing. Frank should have felt proud. Instead, he couldn't sleep. Every time a car passed by, his stomach twisted. Every knock at the door felt like Judgment Day. He'd built the perfect plan, but he couldn't control human nature. Ray, the youngest, was cracking. He couldn't handle the silence, the hiding, the lies. He spent his days staring at his phone, wanting to call his girlfriend, his mother, someone. He'd never kept a secret this big in his life. And that's when the first real mistake happened. It started with a party. Ray's girlfriend, Gina, turned 21. She wanted to celebrate, so Ray showed up in a new jacket with a gold chain he swore he found on sale. He paid for everyone's drinks. $100 bills. Just like that. He was careful not to use too much, but money has a smell, and people noticed. The bartender did too. He remembered seeing something on the news about stolen cash with specific serial numbers. Just out of curiosity, he checked. Match. He didn't go to the police, not right away. But rumors started. Whispers spread. The story of a broke guy suddenly swimming in cash. And Frank noticed. By the 3rd month, the group had stopped trusting each other. Derek kept calling Frank about his share. Tony wanted to move his cut to Mexico. Ray started avoiding everyone. It was falling apart. One night, Frank called a meeting one last time in the same warehouse where it all began. His voice was low, steady, but dangerous. Somebody's getting sloppy. Somebody's putting us all at risk. No one spoke. The silence was suffocating. Tony broke it first. "You think it's me?" Frank's eyes moved slowly around the room. "I know it's one of you." For a moment, no one moved. The air felt electric, full of fear, anger, and the weight of too much money. Frank slammed his fist on the table. "If anyone so much as breathes wrong, this all burns." They left that night in silence, each one wondering who would be the first to fall. They had pulled off the perfect crime, but perfection dies the moment trust disappears. By February, 3 months after the heist, the money had become more curse than blessing. The crew no longer met in daylight. They spoke in code, used burner phones, and avoided eye contact when they crossed paths in the neighborhood. The silence was heavy, the kind that cracked under pressure. Frank Marino, the mastermind, spent most nights sitting in his dark apartment, curtains drawn, a .38 revolver on the coffee table. He'd always been calm, methodical, but something had changed. He wasn't sleeping. He was watching the news, watching the street, watching his friends. He knew what greed did to men. He'd seen it before. And now it was happening again. The first real fracture came from Tony Ramirez. Tony was built like a wall, confident and loud, but the kind of man who couldn't keep still when temptation called. The cash burned a hole in his conscience. He'd started gambling again, small bets at first, just to feel alive, then bigger ones. One night, after losing $5,000 in poker, he told a friend, "Money's easy." There's always more where that came from. The wrong person heard it. That friend was an informant for LAPD's organized crime unit. Within 48 hours, the information was passed along to the FBI task force still investigating the Dunbar robbery. Meanwhile, Ray Lopez, the youngest of the group, was spiraling. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. His girlfriend, Gina, kept asking where the money came from. He kept lying, but guilt had a way of gnawing through his chest. Then one night, after an argument, Gina threatened to leave. "You're hiding something, Ray. You're going to end up in jail or worse." Ray panicked. He went straight to Frank's house, midnight, pounding on the door. Frank opened it, eyes bloodshot. "She's asking questions." Ray stammered. "I think she knows." Frank didn't blink. "Then you make sure she doesn't." His tone was calm, but it wasn't advice. It was an order. Ray froze. "You're not saying—" "I'm saying," Frank interrupted, "if she talks, we all go down." That night, Ray sat outside Gina's apartment, engine running, tears in his eyes. He couldn't do it. Instead, he packed a bag and vanished. 2 days later, the FBI found him, not through detective work, but through bad luck. A state trooper pulled him over for a broken taillight near Bakersfield. In the trunk, $350,000 in water-damaged cash, still wrapped in Dunbar bank straps. It was over for Ray. When Frank heard the news, he knew the clock had started ticking. The arrest hit the news that night. Dunbar armored heist connection. One man in custody. Tony saw it first and called Frank, voice trembling. "He's going to talk. You know he's going to talk." Frank's silence on the other end said everything. By dawn, Tony disappeared too. The FBI began connecting dots fast. Ray confessed after 12 hours in interrogation. He wasn't built for prison walls or guilt. He gave them everything: the warehouse, the names, the plan. Frank Marino, Tony Ramirez, Eddie the driver, Derek the tech guy. He spilled it all and cried doing it. 2 days later, the task force raided a warehouse in East L.A., the same place the crew had planned their heist. Inside, they found fingerprints, receipts, and an empty metal drum where the cash had once been hidden. Frank was gone. Eddie, too. Only Derek remained, trembling in his apartment, surrounded by security monitors, watching himself unravel. When they kicked down his door, he didn't resist. He just muttered, "I knew it'd end like this." But the betrayal wasn't over. Frank found Tony hiding at a cousin's auto shop in San Bernardino. He walked in quietly, revolver tucked under his jacket. Tony looked up, shocked, scared, guilty. "Frank, listen." Frank didn't. "You talked to someone," he said coldly. "Now the feds know everything." Tony tried to deny it, but Frank saw the fear in his eyes. He raised a gun. "I told you, Tony. One mistake. One shot. Then silence." Frank dumped the gun and vanished into the desert. Within a week, the FBI had everyone except Frank. Eddie turned himself in, tired of running. Derek cooperated. Ray was in custody. Tony was gone. And Frank Marino, the man who planned the most cinematic heist in American history, was now the most wanted man in California. The world had turned their crime into a legend. But legends don't end with credits. They end in blood, betrayal, and a kind of silence that no amount of money can buy. The morning after Tony Ramirez's body was found, the FBI knew one thing for certain. Frank Marino was alive, armed, and desperate. The crime that had once looked like a movie was unraveling like one too. The agency launched a manhunt stretching from Los Angeles to Nevada, calling it Operation Desert Shadow. Helicopters combed the Mojave. Roadblocks dotted the interstate. Agents monitored airports and gas stations, flashing Frank's face. Square jaw, gray eyes, calm even in the chaos, to anyone who would listen. But Frank Marino wasn't the kind of man to run without a plan. He'd been preparing for this day since the first brick of money went missing from a vault. 3 years earlier, Frank had opened a small auto parts import business under a fake name, Vincent Moretti. Quiet location, clean tax records, legitimate invoices. It wasn't about the business. It was about the paper trail. If the heist ever fell apart, he'd need a place to disappear into. That plan was now in motion. He abandoned his car near Lancaster, traded clothes with a homeless man, and disappeared into the desert. While agents chased tips about bus stations and motel sightings, Frank walked barefoot beneath the desert sun, heading east. By nightfall, he'd crossed the state line into Nevada. Back in Los Angeles, the FBI interrogation room was full. Derek Coleman, the tech guy, was hunched over, sweating through his shirt. Agent Laura Keene placed a photo of Tony's body in front of him. "This is what happens when you stay quiet," she said. "Frank doesn't protect anyone. He erases them." Derek's hands shook. He said we'd all make it, that no one would ever get caught. "Then why are you sitting here?" she asked. He broke in under an hour. He told them about a safe house in Pahrump, Nevada, a cabin, unregistered, cash paid, used once before during the planning of the heist. It was their first real lead. In Nevada, Frank had reached that same cabin. It sat at the edge of the desert, half-sunk, lonely, with a broken porch light that flickered when the wind blew. Inside were crates of canned food, a few guns, and a black duffel bag with $1.5 million in cash, his last clean stash. He made coffee and sat by the window, staring at the horizon. Frank wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of fading, of becoming just another name in an FBI file. He'd planned the perfect heist, executed it with precision, and still, greed had undone him. In his journal, later recovered by investigators, he wrote, "The money was never the prize. It was the control, the feeling that I could bend the world. And for a moment, I did." On the 5th day, a drone spotted movement near the cabin. By dawn, the place was surrounded. Desert silence replaced by engines, radios, and the crunch of boots. Agent Keene led the operation. She wanted him alive. "Frank Marino," she shouted through a megaphone. "You're surrounded. Come out with your hands up." No response. For 5 minutes, the desert held its breath. Then a single shot echoed, not from outside, but from inside the cabin. When agents broke through the door, Frank was sitting in a chair, gun in hand, a half-empty cup of coffee on the table. The walls around him were covered with maps, plans, and old photos of the crew, a silent storyboard of the perfect crime that ended like every imperfect one. He had taken his own life. In the weeks that followed, the FBI recovered nearly $3.2 million of the stolen $18.9 million. The rest was never found. Some believe Frank buried it before going on the run. Others said he burned it to erase the evidence. Either way, it was gone, swallowed by the same desert that claimed him. Eddie served 12 years. Derek got 7 after cooperating. Ray Lopez was released early for good behavior and later became a construction worker in Texas. All of them carried the same ghost, the memory of the man who almost pulled off the impossible. The media called it the Dunbar Heist, the movie that wrote itself. Hollywood adapted it twice, though the ending was always too dark for audiences. Reporters loved to say that Frank Marino had outsmarted everyone but himself. Years later, an FBI agent summed it up best. He planned for everything, except the human heart. The pond where it began, the warehouse where it was planned, and the cabin where it ended, all remain. Silent witnesses to a crime that could have been fiction if it hadn't been real. Because sometimes the line between Hollywood and hell is thinner than anyone wants to believe. Years passed. The world moved on. New crimes made headlines. New faces filled wanted lists. But the story of Frank Marino refused to fade. Somewhere between myth and memory, his name lingered in whispers. The man who almost pulled off the impossible. The Dunbar Heist became a legend, a case study in law enforcement seminars, a script in Hollywood backrooms, a symbol of how genius and greed can share the same heartbeat. Yet, to those who lived it, it wasn't a story. It was a scar. Eddie Morales, the driver, walked out of prison 12 years later. He was older, slower, but alive, something not everyone from the crew could say. He settled in Arizona under a different name, driving delivery trucks at night. Sometimes, when headlights hit the desert sand just right, he swore he could see Frank's figure ahead, calm, collected, leading him down another empty road. He would blink, and the vision would vanish, but the guilt never did. Derek Coleman, the tech guy, disappeared after his release. The FBI believed he moved to Canada under witness protection, but rumor had it he worked for a cybersecurity firm. The irony not lost on anyone who knew his past. In one anonymous blog post found years later, a writer calling himself DC wrote, "He was brilliant. He didn't steal for money. He stole for meaning, for proof that he could bend the system and walk away." Maybe that's why I followed him, because for one moment, we all felt unstoppable. Ray Lopez, Eddie's cousin, found faith and peace in Texas. He became a construction worker, married, had 2 kids, and refused every interview request that came his way. When a reporter once asked if he missed the money, Ray just smiled and said, "The money burned faster than guilt ever will." As for Frank Marino, his body was buried in a simple grave outside Pahrump. No visitors, no family, no flowers. The headstone read only, Frank Marino, 1968 to 2001. Nothing lasts forever, but that wasn't the end. Every few years, a rumor would surface. A stash of old cash discovered in the desert, a safety deposit box opened under the name Vincent Moretti, or strange deposits made in offshore accounts. None ever traced back to Frank, but every whisper added to his legend. The FBI officially closed the case in 2010. Unofficially, many believe not all of Frank's money died with him. In a final interview before her retirement, Agent Laura Keene looked straight into the camera and said, "Frank Marino was the smartest criminal I ever chased. He didn't want wealth. He wanted control, to prove that for once, he was the one writing the rules. And for a while he did." She paused. But control is an illusion. You can't outsmart your own conscience. The desert where it all ended is silent now. Just wind, sand, and the faint memory of a man who dared to turn his life into a movie. No soundtrack. No closing credits. Just the truth. Sometimes, the greatest heists aren't about stealing money. They're about stealing time, stealing control, stealing a story that feels bigger than life itself. And when it's all over, what's left behind isn't gold or glory. Just ghosts and the sound of the wind whispering the name. Frank Marino,